I think he's a man for our times. And I say this because I think we are desperate for leaders who are unafraid to be centrists.
There is a recurring temptation to feel that some spectacular and costly action could become the miraculous solution to all current difficulties. A huge increase in newer elements of our defenses, development of unrealistic programs to cure every ill in agriculture. These and many other possibilities, each possibly promising in itself, may be suggested as the only way to the road we wish to travel. But each proposal must be weighed in the light of a broader consideration, the need to maintain balance.
On the podcast today, I'm speaking with William Hitchcock. He is the author of The Age of Eisenhower, America and the World in the 1950s. He teaches history at the University of Virginia, and he joins me on the podcast. William, thanks for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me, Bruce.
You know, what struck me reading your book, something that Theodore White said about Eisenhower. He makes people happy. No cavalcade I have followed in the entourage of any other political figure in this country has ever left so many smiling, glowing people behind as an Eisenhower tour. The 70-year-old hero with his cherubic pink face drew from the crowds a yearning burst of cheers. And it's really true then and true now. There's very few people who dislike Eisenhower. What did he do to get that reputation, and how come it's been so hard for anyone else to follow him?
That's a great question. I think the thing that I learned the most about Eisenhower in writing this book was how his contemporaries viewed him rather than the way history came to view him. Because his contemporaries, not just the voters, but the people who worked with him, his peers in the military, they absolutely admired him, and they said again and again and again, and I've tried to pull this out in a kind of character profile of him in the book, that Eisenhower radiated immense charisma. And although we tend to see him now in the past in black and white and as a rather elderly figure, a kind of a figure sort of from the past. At the time, Eisenhower was one of those guys, who walked into the room and every head swiveled and everyone said, that's the most important man, not just in the room, but possibly in the country. And he had that effect on people, not only when he was president, but even in his early years in the military. He just had a quality that people were drawn to. And I think this is something so crucial to political success, is a sense of confidence, authenticity, comfortable in his own skin. He'd been a great athlete. He walked with kind of a sense of vigor, a sense of confidence. He grew up in Kansas, but he traveled around the world, so he could be both a kind of Midwesterner and a Westerner, but he was also a very sophisticated man. He spoke in very plain, ordinary language that people understood and felt was clear and authentic. He just had this sense of being a kind of quintessential American, and everyone felt, I think he understands me. I think I trust that guy. And so the keys to his political success were both, great intellect and skill, which he kind of downplayed, but then this personality that was so warm and charismatic and appealing.
I mean, you consider him a good politician.
He was a brilliant politician. I mean, this is the great myth about Eisenhower, was that it was all easy for him. He was a popular general, so of course he was going to get elected president. But in fact, he was a good politician while he was in the military. You don't climb to the top of the military, the army, without having some political skills. But he had a natural way of retailing his ideas, what he wanted to get done, in a way that seemed very unthreatening, that seemed right, that seemed appealing to a large constituency. And that's kind of what you need to be able to do as a politician.
And he strikes me as one of those guys. They said this about George Washington. A few others, Zach Taylor, a couple other presidents, where maybe Grant, hard to get inside, keeping things close to the vest?
Definitely. No, he was not. He was not a 21st century figure. He didn't emote and talk about his inner feelings and so forth. But what he did do was, again, I keep coming back to that word authenticity, because Eisenhower was a true believer in the American experiment, and he was unashamed about that. When politicians say that today, you kind of expect it, and you say, well, of course he's going to say that. He loves America. When Eisenhower said it, it rang true, because here was a man who really could have done anything. He was so skilled in many ways, but he was a public servant for his whole life. He gave his whole life to the military and then to public service, with a brief tour as head of Columbia University. And he was just someone who was a sort of, as he put it, he was a fanatic about America. And I think this is, again, what people were drawn to, was this sense of his patriotism, his joy about the United States.
Understandably proud of this preeminence, we yet realize that America's leadership and prestige depend not merely upon our unmatched material progress, riches, and military strength, but on how we use our power in the interest of world peace.
Been around the world and seen a lot of other countries where things were a mess, and he felt the United States was special.
Yeah, well, I think then you get away from a kind of cartoonish vision of that America. If you're talking about the 1950s, it was a time when we were proving it, had just beaten dictatorships around the world, and the 1950s is often heralded by people now. We were just talking about a podcast about the good old days and income inequality and workers' wages and things like that. But the 50s is one of those periods where we definitely look back fondly. Yours is a book about Eisenhower, but also a bit about the 50s. Was it really a good time?
Well, this is a crucial question, because one of the reasons that Eisenhower was so sort of downplayed by a lot of historians, and especially even people writing about him right after his presidency, was they said, well, the 50s was an easy decade. Everything was going fine. Everyone was making money. There was no wars. Anybody could have been president. Anybody would have looked good in that decade. Gee, you try running the country in the 60s, and then that's real trouble. And my feeling is, that's completely ahistorical. The 1950s was a complicated decade filled with tensions and conflict. I mean,
for every old blackboard, there are now hundreds of new electronic computers. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite. It is the task of statesmanship to mold, to balance, and to integrate these and other forces, new and old, within the principles of our democratic system.
At the beginning of the decade, the Korean War was going. Eisenhower gets in. He's got McCarthyism and the Red Scare on his plate. He's still got the Korean War to deal with. He's got the march of the Soviet Union that is becoming more industrialized and beginning, they put Sputnik up into the skies in the late 50s and are building a arsenal of missiles. You got the civil rights problems that are starting to spike and becoming a real question about what direction the country's going toward in terms of racial politics. There were economic highs, but there were also some economic lows in the 50s, 2 recessions in that decade. So it's a time just like any other time when there are complexities, challenges, policy problems. I wouldn't say it was some kind of golden time when no one had to lift a finger. I mean, really, it was still a period of anxiety. Eisenhower used the term, we live in an age of peril. The anxiety about the Cold War was very palpable.
Yeah, I mean, I think more of that, and I just, one of my great regrets is that I'll never get the chance to talk to the great David Halberstam ever, but reading his book, The 50s, and you see that little bit of a darker vision, and Tip O'Neill's biography, he talks about how in the 50s in Massachusetts, I mean, there were people starving, or people without good public education. So there's this idea that it was this miracle time.
We pray that peoples of all faiths, all races, all nations may have their great human needs satisfied, that those now denied opportunity shall come to enjoy it to the full, that all who yearn for freedom may experience its spiritual blessings.
Some of the policies that change that were, come out of the New Deal, Great Society, New Deal, but talking specifically about the New Deal, and you look at Eisenhower, and he's one of those guys, because he's GOP, I think a lot of people on the left particularly like Eisenhower because anything he says, that's positive perhaps about like a New Deal program or Social Security or something like that, can be used as kind of a lever. There's a little bit of this dynamic with Ronald Reagan too. But what was his policy towards the New Deal programs of FDR and Truman?
Well, as like a good politician, and again, I stipulate that I think he was a very savvy politician. He ran for president as a conservative, and he governed as a moderate. It's a classic case. In 1952, he poured scorn on the New Deal. He was extremely critical of what he called the sort of the creep of state socialism. He said on the hustings, the New Deal is threatening to become a new kind of dictatorship in which the government provides for everybody, and then individual initiative is smothered, and then there's no gumption anymore, and people will just be turned into zombies. And it sounds like a caricature, and of course it was, but he was running for president, and he wanted to distinguish himself from the other guys. So he pitched his campaign really to the base of his party, which was at that time still very hostile to the New Deal. But when he came into office, it was a different story. The inherent moderate in him came out. The thing that we always point to, and I think it is significant, is that he took the Social Security program, the greatest legacy and arguably of the New Deal, and he passed legislation that expanded it to self-employed people. So suddenly, about 10 million people were added to the rolls of Social Security who hadn't been on it before. So we say he expanded Social Security rather than cutting it. He was actually in favor of it because Social Security is a perfect kind of moderate Republican thing. You have to work to pay into it, and then you get a reward later, but you have to work. And in other areas, he was quite moderate. He kept tax rates pretty high in the 50s. He was a great believer in infrastructure spending. He had ideas about public housing and even a kind of national health insurance program. So the big takeaway here is Ike believed government could be good, that it could work well, that it could help improve the lives of citizens, provided that it didn't take control of citizens' lives.
We have there's a president in office now who could be, without getting too deep into it, one could make a pretty easy criticism about his organizational skills or how, there's different messages for each day. He seems to be taking a lot of different positions. But Eisenhower is an example of somebody who applied military principles to the White House. For instance, the first real chief of staff position in Sherman Adams, and then from there building kind of a hierarchy to make decisions. Now, is that true, or is that some of that just like kind of the image that we have of him?
Oh, no, it's definitely true. I mean, I think we tend to forget, because the personalities of Roosevelt and Truman are so large and they're so significant, and we respect them in their historical legacy. But those guys ran a really messy White House operation. I mean, Roosevelt basically, had a tiny staff, and he never told anybody everything. So he played all of his advisors off against each other. He kept everything secret, never wrote anything down. Truman was a catastrophically disorganized executive in many ways, and it showed. And so Eisenhower comes into the White House, which is, the staff is small, it's a little chaotic, and he says, well, we're going to have a different system. And there's no doubt that he brings a kind of a kind of military planning organization to it, which was natural for him. I mean, that's how he helped to win the Second World War, was by planning and having a good staff. So he definitely brought in Sherman Adams, who was a former governor of New Hampshire, a very, very flinty, silent, kind of tough guy. He rapidly became known as the abominable no man because he always said no to everything and everybody. He was the perfect chief of staff. He was totally loyal to Eisenhower, and he could care less about everybody else. And then he used the National Security Council. He used the cabinet in a very disciplined way. Ike knew how government and big bureaucracies work, and he tried to make the presidency more effective in a way I think that shaped later presidencies for sure.
And another thing where you get a sense of him, I think you give an example in the book where, in terms of foreign power relations, particularly relations with the Soviet Union at that time, which were tense, he compares it to a poker game. You want to put all your white chips, all your blue chips, everything up there. Let them know that you'll use it if you have to.
Yeah.
But then encourage negotiations where possible. Tough stance. A lot of leaders today, I'm sure even the current president and Presidents Reagan, Presidents Bush, who advocate that kind of stance, would probably take that lesson from Eisenhower.
Well, I'll say that Eisenhower believed in amassing power, and that's kind of general he was. He was a heavy heavy package kind of general. He didn't believe in the surgical strike. It was about crushing the enemy, and that's what he did in Europe in 1944 and 45. As no shock and awe, it's just total, complete domination. And that's the American way of war in which he was trained, and that's really the principles he brought into the White House, which is, I'm going to amass all the power that I need, whether it's on domestic, dealing with domestic politics, or if it's dealing with the Soviets. And I'm going to let them know that I've got everything here ready to go, and if you want to go that way, we can do that. But if you prefer to negotiate, I'm definitely open to negotiation. And Eisenhower created in the minds of his adversaries a certain amount of uncertainty. He kept them guessing, and he was just a little bit hard to read for the Soviets, and it made them a little bit anxious. And they never really tested Eisenhower in a way that they tested John Kennedy, for example, in the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it's very revealing. I think Khrushchev looked at Eisenhower and thought, that's a very serious man. I'm not sure I really want to get into a poker game with him.
Yeah, no, I think Khrushchev definitely seized the opportunity that Kennedy provided. Eisenhower, at least when Kennedy was a candidate, not a Kennedy fan.
No. Well, and why would he be?
He was the young whippersnapper.
Yeah. I mean, the Kennedy that we know, the Kennedy that we know as president, the remarkable orator, the man who could inspire people, the visionary, the man who just called something out of us as Americans and made us think about our country in a different way. That Kennedy was not really quite present yet in 1960, or certainly not in 1958 or 57 when he was emerging as a possible candidate. So, Eisenhower knew Kennedy as a very young, inexperienced senator who would say and do anything to get ahead. That's how I viewed him, and he mistrusted him. I think he misread Kennedy initially, and I think he came to respect him once Kennedy became president. But in the 1960 campaign, of course, Kennedy was running against Nixon, but really he was running against Eisenhower because he was running against the old Republican Party. He was running against the old generation of leaders from that time, and he said a lot of things in the 1960 campaign that were pretty bitter in terms of criticizing Eisenhower for being, boring and asleep and retirement and being like an elephant and, with the kind of dull and slow and whatnot. And Eisenhower did take it personally.
It struck me, and this is something that, although I've studied this period a lot, how much Eisenhower was affected by Nixon's defeat, where I had maybe thought, it wasn't his presidency, and he had some iffy feelings about Nixon anyway. But your book reveals that Eisenhower was pretty hurt by Kennedy's win.
Well, it devastated him because he felt it was a personal defeat. He felt that a 43-year-old senator with no experience suddenly had defeated Eisenhower, whereas really he defeated Nixon, and Nixon was a very was really not a terrific candidate in 1960. He hadn't found his particular voice. He was running for a third Eisenhower term, but he was no Eisenhower, so he was not a great candidate. And but I think that Eisenhower did take it personally. He was very blue. He was very down. At the same time, and this is a puzzle, bit of a paradox, Eisenhower didn't do a great deal to help Richard Nixon win in 1960. And that's a curious aspect of his competitive personality. I think he never believed Nixon would make a great president, and I think he felt that he himself had been a great president, and it bothered him a little bit. He never said it, but it bothered him a little bit that Nixon was going to be the next Eisenhower. I don't think he ever thought Nixon really matched up. So on the one hand, he was kind of, I think there was not enough fire in the belly about Nixon running, and on the other hand, he was terribly sad when Nixon lost.
Because it was a little bit of a mark against him. I compare that to the situation today in understanding 2016 and what it might be like, say, for President Obama. Relatively popular. I mean, he had his critics, of course, but I mean, not as popular as Eisenhower all the time. But in some polls here or there, yes, different times. Relatively popular president, 2 terms.
Yep.
Not seriously challenged. I guess 2012 got a little close, but not much more than rhetoric, kind of like the 1956 election. And then, gets into the tail end of his year, and it seems like going to pass it off to a successor, and also a successor that has some challenges, that maybe wasn't the best candidate and had critics. And this person with no experience in government then becomes president.
Yeah, no, it must have been devastating. And I'm sure that one day former President Obama will speak more fully about how he felt the day after the election and in the weeks after the election. He's doing the right thing now, which is to, in a sense, step back a little bit. Although he's getting back involved in politics in state races and so on. But
that's right.
I'm sure it was devastating, and in many ways it was a worse defeat because President Trump was a figure who had been a leading critic and not just a critic, but a scourge of Obama's throughout his presidency.
Yeah.
And so for Trump to win and to effectively defeat the third Obama term, I just can't imagine anything worse. At least with Kennedy, Eisenhower could say, well, the Democrats got back in. That's kind of the cycles of American history. Pendulum swings. It's not the end of the world. Kennedy was a recognizable figure, a leader of the Democratic Party. Trump was not a recognizable figure, and it seemed such a dramatic departure from the norm. So I'm sure that for President Obama to see his successor in the Democratic Party, Hillary Clinton, go down to defeat to someone who was so outside of the system, I think that must have just been a catastrophic blow.
And I wonder about the impact on history. I talk about this a bit, that for a president to pass off the presidency, as did Reagan, really the last successful one in recent memory with George H.W. Bush. If for a president to pass off, says something about their presidency, and for a president to not be able to pass off same policy, even where they're personally popular, seems to be like a little bit of a mark.
Well, I think that for all of his talents and his success while in office, the one area that he was not as successful at was in building the Republican Party into a party that could carry his legacy in the future. So not just that Nixon didn't get elected in 1960, but that the Republican Party hadn't figured out where it was going to be. And you see that in 1964 when, against Eisenhower's judgment, Goldwater gets the nomination, and then he takes the party in a very different direction. And then 1968, it's Nixon, but it's not the same Nixon of 1960. It's a much craftier, more sharply partisan, and further to the right Nixon in 1968. He wins. So the Republican Party is not the Eisenhower party of centrism and moderateness. It goes further to the right, and of course the Reagan Revolution changes that and institutionalizes that. So one of the marks against Eisenhower, you could say, is that he didn't build the Republican Party into a machine that could extend his image. And in fact, you look at the the congressional races throughout his presidency, and the Republicans lost seats in the Congress at every election during the Eisenhower years, from 54, 56, and 58. The party was hollowed out, but in a large extent, even as Eisenhower was the most popular man in America, and in fact, the most popular two-term president since the end of the Second World War. So that's a real puzzle.
Yeah, it's a very similar thing, too, to Obama's presidency.
Yeah.
Popular 2 terms, wildly popular in the beginning there, but yet the party infrastructure gets hollowed out. Hundreds of state seats lost, and the Congress twice, eventually losing the Senate. Eisenhower kind of got along at least well enough with Lyndon Johnson, the Democratic majority leader at the time.
Yeah, I mean, well, yes and no. Yes and no. I mean, they got along. Okay.
Although I must admit, I'm probably getting that more from Lyndon Johnson's side, which is probably biased.
Well, Johnson would say he'd get along with anybody, but Johnson was a man who was so ambitious, and when he was in the Senate, and he was so crafty, and he knew how to wield legislative power. I mean, Robert Cairo has demonstrated this so brilliantly in his many books. And so when Eisenhower wanted to get something done and it had to go through Johnson, Johnson really made him pay a price. And it was not easy. Johnson was able to really embarrass the administration during the Sputnik crisis. He held a lot of hearings that highlighted what he claimed were the weaknesses and the missile gap and the falling behind the Soviets and so forth. That was a terrible political crisis. And he also helped to pass, but also helped to weaken the 1957 Civil Rights Act that Eisenhower thought would be a real legacy of his, but turned out to be kind of a dead letter because Johnson, a Southern Democrat, basically took out all the teeth. So they had Johnson and Eisenhower is an interesting relationship. They admired one another, I think, to a sense, but they were pretty tough fighters and in their respective corners.
The premium podcast from My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. For as little as $2 a month, you'll get more content, including an extra podcast where we have additional content. For instance, in this interview, we're going to talk a bit about Eisenhower and civil rights. In the premium podcast, we're going to go more into detail about the 1957 Civil Rights Bill signed by Eisenhower, what it did, what it didn't do, what he wanted it to do, and how Lyndon Johnson and others changed that. That's on the premium podcast, along with at least 40 other bonus content items and episodes that you won't hear on the normal podcast channel. It can be as little as $2 a month, more if you want to support the program more and get more things. www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics.premium.com. You brought up civil rights, so let's talk about it. I think that's one of the points you might have just made there, that perhaps Eisenhower was looking for a stronger bill in 57. It does create a federal department, but not much else. Yeah. What's his legacy on civil rights? And let's ask that question, judging him from the 1950s, like let's say we're not applying too much of I caution my audience, too much of our modern blinders on there. How should we view him on civil rights, judging it from the situation as it was in the 1950s?
Well, that's a very important sort of caveat that you've put down there. I totally agree with you. The fact is, if we look at him from today, he looks like he's just part of an antique generation of powerful white leaders who really just didn't understand the crisis of civil rights and really didn't do much to help it along. But if you look at it from the 50s, you see that it's just the opposite. Here's a man who really wasn't prepared to deal with the civil rights issues of the day. He had no background. He really had no understanding of the issues. But instead of staying in his lane and saying, "Hey, that's not my problem. Those aren't my people. It's not my constituency," he actually made a number of just critical interventions that that contemporaries at the time, both white and black, viewed as very significant. Critics in the South were very critical of Eisenhower's policies on civil rights because they felt he was going much too fast, much too far. And many African-American leaders of the 50s praised Eisenhower for what he was doing. And we tend to forget this, but African-Americans voted Republican in the 1950s in pretty significant numbers.
Right.
In 1956, Eisenhower got 40% of the black vote. 40%. By far the largest percentage of any Republican ever, since that time. So, it kind of scrambles your circuits a little bit. So he has a important legacy, and the keynotes, of course, are appointing Earl Warren to the Supreme Court and getting the Brown versus Board decision through. That Eisenhower didn't write that decision, obviously, but he knew that Warren was a progressive on civil rights when he appointed him. There's no question he knew that decision was already in the works. That case was already in the works when he appointed Warren to the court. And then we get a little bit of a cool down where he's anxious that maybe it is going too fast. And in the 54, 55, 56, Eisenhower's sort of slowing down a little bit. But then he wants another legacy piece of legislation. He pushes forward the Civil Rights Act of 1957, trying to strengthen the hand of the Attorney General to intervene in civil rights cases in the South. And that gets weakened by the Democrats, Southern Democrats, but nonetheless it does get through. And then you get the capstone event, really an outstanding example of Eisenhower's leadership, and that's the intervention in Little Rock in 1957 to enforce the Supreme Court's ruling that public schools be desegregated. It killed Eisenhower to do that. He hated the decision to send in federal troops into Little Rock. But his view was the law is the law, and there is no way some governor anywhere can defy federal authority. That would be the end of our system. And he had no hesitations once he saw it in those terms. He had no hesitations. But typical of his time, he was a man who wasn't quite sure what to make of the civil rights cause. It wasn't his cause. It wasn't his language, and it took him a while to learn, in a sense. And I think he learned on the job. I think he became more sympathetic, empathetic. But of course, he's no civil rights hero. He's a kind of a figure that is a transitional figure, a crucial transitional figure in this regard. And I think his legacy is actually really very important and quite significant.
Where I think he doesn't add to the majesty of the rhetoric of civil rights. He doesn't add to the great speeches. His speech at Little Rock is, as you reference, almost entirely about federal power. There is no adjoining rhetoric about why this is a good cause. He is merely meeting speaking to you from the room of Jefferson and Jackson and Lincoln and telling you that I must enforce the court's decision. Right. He doesn't add to that. But maybe it was too early. Maybe it would have been helpful. He does have some politics, I guess, governor of South Carolina, governor of Texas. He wants, he's Jimmy Burns' friend, and he wants the state of Texas in the 56 and 60 elections. So it's, he's got some politics there too.
Yeah, he's balancing it out. I like what you said about he doesn't add to the majesty of the rhetoric, and I think you're right. He doesn't ever seize the question in a way that heightens the moral stakes of the civil rights crisis, and that's because that's just not who he was. He really didn't do that when confronting many issues, and that's where today we hear him as a little tone deaf. But I would also add, just as an example, that John F. Kennedy also took a long time to grasp the moral dimensions of the civil rights crisis. So, it's not as if there was waiting in the wings the great president of the 1950s who could have dramatically changed the civil rights landscape in a way that Eisenhower failed to do. I mean, that's just not true. If Adlai Stevenson had won, after all, Stevenson was the head of a Democratic Party that was completely divided on race.
Right.
His first vice presidential candidate was John Sparkman of Alabama, who was a segregationist. So that Stevenson was quite cool on civil rights. So in a way, I think you get maybe the best you could have gotten out of Eisenhower in the decade of the 50s. Kennedy's going to be a critical transitional figure too. It takes him a while to get to 1963, where he actually embraces the moral imperative here. And then everything changes after that.
Let's talk about, because you've got to, with Eisenhower, the military-industrial complex.
Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.
I have a little maybe different view on that, and I know he makes a speech at the end of his presidency, and certainly everyone looks at that today as a warning against, say, military power or something like that. But I think it's important to remember that, as we discussed earlier, he also kind of built up the government, and part of that building up of the government was building up a more permanent military, a permanent, let's say, provision of military equipment versus just, what we used to do in the past, World War I, World War II. When there's a war, we convert, General Motors into the war machine and do it at that time. He kind of, his presidency oversees this kind of permanent, really the permanent military complex that he describes. What is that warning really against? I wish you would talk about that a bit.
Yeah, I think it's a wonderful speech, and I think people should read the whole thing, because your hunch, I think, is completely borne out here, in that Eisenhower admits in the speech, he says, hey, we have been facing a terrible trial in dealing with the aggression around the world of the communist bloc. And in order to preserve freedom, in order to preserve our liberties, he says, we've had to build up a military-industrial complex. We had to create it. And that has required a permanent peacetime military establishment. And he said, we don't like it. It would be nice if we didn't have to have it, but we do. And the truth is that during the Eisenhower period, we accepted a very, very high degree of permanent military spending in peacetime. I mean, and that's something different from the war years, from the First World War, Second World War, Korean War period. We're spending, 10% of GDP throughout the 1950s on the defense budget, which is a titanic sum of money. I mean, even today it's around 3 or 4. So Eisenhower had to defend that, and he defended it by saying, "Look, we're in a long-run, long-haul war against the Soviets. We're keeping it cold, but we got to be ready in case anything goes bad." Having said that, then he goes on to say, we have to guard against the unwarranted influence of this military-industrial complex. So what he meant by that was generals and the military industry will always ask for more. And leaders have to say no. Leaders have to say no to the military. Leaders have to say no to the corporations and the technological guys. And I think what he was saying was, the man you just elected president, John F. Kennedy, has no experience in doing this. So citizens of America, hold his feet to the fire. Make sure you understand that he needs to say no to or else he'll be he'll be eaten alive by the interests of this system we've created. I think there's a slight veiled warning and criticism of Kennedy, because it's just a couple of days before he leaves the White House permanently. And he said, I could do it. Eisenhower could control the military-industrial complex. We'll see about this young whippersnapper.
Yeah, I mean, that is such an interesting interpretation of it, because that is probably completely the reverse of the way a lot of people, particularly those around the left side of politics, see that warning.
Yeah.
I also read in there notes of the same things that he said about New Deal programs. In other words, this military spending is just a new government program, and you have to be a little careful, because with government programs, they can provide some good. He likes the Social Security, but you also have to be aware of the complexes that build around them, and people just start endlessly lobbying for them to go up and up and up. Yeah, so I saw
exactly.
that. One of the other things he seems concerned about with Kennedy coming in, I read the Richard Reeves, President Kennedy, and they talk about Eisenhower and Kennedy's first meeting right before Kennedy's inauguration. And I'm sure, the old general's a little suspicious, this youngster. but he's going to be the next president. So he says something like, look, one of the things I wasn't able to resolve was Southeast Asia, and this comment now seems like, at least this is Reeves' account of it. I mean, this comment now seems like so, prophetic. What is his involvement in Vietnam? And, does he deserve any blame for that?
Well, it's a story that changes over time. In 1954, when the French Empire is falling apart and they're begging the Americans to get involved to help them defeat the Vietnamese in the north, Eisenhower says, "No thanks, we're not getting in. That would be a disaster, and we would be sending in, the Marines and Army divisions to fight in the jungle in Asia on behalf of a colonial empire. That's a no. That's a disaster. We're not going to do that." So he stays out in 1954, but he also turns on the tap, starts funding the South Vietnamese government that emerges from the settlement there in 1954, and so South Vietnam becomes a client state of the United States during Eisenhower's watch. So prestige and money have been expended there, and by the time Kennedy comes in, the picture is a little different. It's really important that South Vietnam stay protected and supported by the United States, in addition to which are the neighboring states, Laos and Cambodia, which were also looking like they were getting a little wobbly. So Eisenhower tells Kennedy, the new president, you're going to have trouble in Southeast Asia. And in particular, the issue they were most worried about was Laos, because there was a revolution going on there, and they feared that Laos might flip to the communist side. So Eisenhower gives Kennedy the impression that Eisenhower, was willing to intervene in Laos in 1960 to halt it going communist. And Kennedy comes away saying, man, if Eisenhower says we should intervene in Laos, and he's known for his restraint, then I better think about that, and maybe that's something I'm going to have to do. So in passing the baton, Eisenhower is basically saying to Kennedy, you might have to gather the troops and actually intervene over there, and on your watch there's going to be big doings in Southeast Asia. So thanks very much, Ike.
Yes.
On his way out the door, he's like, you got a big mess going on down there in Asia.
Yeah, that's the way it struck me, and I think that to an extent, people have looked at Eisenhower and said, well, there was the domino theory. There is the foremost proponent of showing big strength, and what may have gotten us into trouble after many other, presidents. And I mean, you got, of course, the change between Kennedy and Johnson, which I think is hugely significant there, but leading to a theory that, not standing up and making a real stand and not continuing to commit might be something that Eisenhower wouldn't have wanted. And even after his presidency, his image is still there.
Yeah. No, it's so fascinating the way that these transitions reveal characters of presidents and also the characters of the times. The other classic case that Eisenhower burdened Kennedy with was Cuba. And here's a case where, Eisenhower had approved and overseen a development of a pretty big covert operation to overthrow the Castro government, but he didn't have enough time to launch it. So Kennedy comes in. He says, "Wow, there's a huge plan here to set these Cuban exiles into Cuba and let them overthrow Castro." And Eisenhower knew all about it, and he built it and he approved it. So it's probably pretty good. And there's a lot of pressure on Kennedy to deal with Castro, and he approves the plan, and it becomes the Bay of Pigs, and it's a complete disaster. Now, is that Eisenhower's fault or is it Kennedy's? We could have a debate about that.
Yeah.
Kennedy and Eisenhower meet soon after the Bay of Pigs. President Kennedy invites Eisenhower to Camp David and says, geez, what do I do now? And Eisenhower grills him and says, why did you launch that program with so little air support? And why did you, once having gone in, you had to finish it? You couldn't pull out. And he's very critical. So
yeah, I mean, I fall on the Kennedy side. On the it's more Kennedy's blame. My speculation, of course, that's all it is I wonder if Eisenhower had this plan, like he probably had many plans.
Yeah.
I wonder if he would have even launched it.
I think what he would have done, and this I believe is we could demonstrate that he would have been much more careful in analyzing the battle plan. Kennedy just took the CIA's word for it. He had no way. He really did not study the plan, and Ike would have looked at it and said, "Well, I don't like certain elements of this. It's too small. It's too narrow. There's not a plan B. There's too little air support." And that's what he told Kennedy was the way this plan was never fully developed, and so I do think once he would have gotten his hands into the deep the sort of bowels of the invasion plan, I think Ike would have significantly increased its scope. Doesn't mean he would have launched it, although I actually think he would have. I think he really wanted to get rid of Castro terribly, but nonetheless, Kennedy botched it, and it's one of the early stains in his presidency, but from which he learns. But it's a fascinating moment.
Besides what we discussed, anything else that you think is important to know about Eisenhower?
I think he's a man for our times, and I say this because I think we are desperate for leaders who are unafraid to be centrists. Eisenhower was not fundamentally a partisan. He was a party leader, but he wasn't a partisan. He would gladly welcome Democrats into his coalition if they wanted to be there. He pushed out the really radical Republicans out of his coalition. He was a centrist. He wanted the best for the country, and he had a very broad understanding of what that meant. Today, it's not a news item, but I think we all agree we're terribly polarized. There's no middle ground, and there are no leaders that try to run to the middle. They all run to the margins. So I just hope that we can look back and say, we do have examples in our fairly recent past of leaders who knew how to build a political base in the center rather than on the periphery, on the margins, and he became incredibly popular by doing that. So I think we could use a little more Eisenhower, maybe a little less of the sharp polarization in our politics. I don't know that we're going to get it, but I do feel like he's a man we could learn a lot about for our times.
Yeah, I completely agree there. And I've been speaking with William Hitchcock, the author of The Age of Eisenhower, America and the World in the 1950s. William, thanks for coming on My History Can Beat Up Your Politics.
I really appreciate it. A wonderful conversation. Great questions.
And a big thank you to Will Hitchcock for coming on the program today to talk about what is really a popular topic for this audience at My History Can Beat Up Your Politics. Anything about presidents generally, and especially Eisenhower. Everybody likes Ike. Remember about the premium podcast. It can be as little as $2 a month. Help support me, help support the podcast that you like, and get more content. Get archived episodes as well as new premium episodes, including that one we talked about 1957 and the Civil Rights Bill. www.myhistorycanbeatupyourpolitics, premium.com. Thanks for listening.